May 11th, 1943. Attu Island, Alaska, a world away from the beaches of Normandy. And yet, this was American soil. Wind howled across a barren landscape of snow and ice. A place so cold, even the rifles froze. Through the blizzard, a column of U.S. soldiers pushed forward. The 7th Infantry Division. Faces wrapped in frost, bayonets fixed, eyes narrowed against the storm. Each step cracked the crust of frozen earth. Each breath came out as a cloud of white. Their boots sank deep into tundra. Radios hissed, voices breaking through the static. "Blue one, come in. Blue one, do you read?" Only the wind replied. Somewhere ahead, beyond the fog, lay Japanese trenches. The first enemy foothold on American territory since the War of 1812. But no one could see more than 10 yards ahead. A sergeant shouted over the wind, "Stay close, don't lose the line." Then a burst of gunfire, muffled, distant. A flare cut through the snow, red light bleeding into white fog. For a moment, the men froze. They weren't sure if the shots came from the enemy or from their own side. The battle for Attu had begun, not with the roar of artillery, but with confusion, silence, and cold. No parades, no flags. Just men stumbling into a storm that could kill faster than any bullet. Back home, Americans spoke of Guadalcanal, Midway, and North Africa. Few even knew where the Aleutian Islands were, let alone that their sons were dying there. The soldiers of Attu would soon learn the truth. The enemy was not only Japan. It was the land itself, the fog, the frost, the endless gray. They thought the Pacific was far away. They thought the war was across the ocean. They were wrong. Summer, 1942. The Pacific burned from Midway to the Solomon Islands. Japan had just suffered its first great defeat. 4 carriers gone, its illusion of invincibility shattered. But to the north, in the fog-choked Aleutians, Tokyo saw a chance to strike back. The Imperial Japanese Northern Army drew its lines on a map that most Americans couldn't even name. A frozen chain of volcanic islands stretching from Alaska toward Siberia. To them, the Aleutians were more than dots in the ocean. They were a wall, a shield for the northern flank of their empire. On June 6, 1942, 2 Japanese task forces split from the main fleet. Admiral Bushiro Hosogaya commanded one group toward Kiska, another toward Attu, the westernmost points of Alaska. The orders were simple: seize and hold. To Japan, this was strategy. To the United States, it would soon become humiliation. In Tokyo, officers of the Imperial Navy spoke confidently. "No enemy would dare land here," one commander said. "Even the wind is our ally." They believed nature itself protected them. The same storms that made these islands nearly unreachable would also make them untouchable. But that arrogance was built on a fatal miscalculation. When Japanese troops came ashore, they met no resistance. The small American garrisons had already evacuated. Radio Tokyo broadcast the news as if it were Pearl Harbor all over again. The rising sun now flies over American soil. Across the Pacific, Americans listened in disbelief. For the first time since the War of 1812, foreign troops stood on U.S. territory. In Washington, panic rippled through the corridors of the War Department. The Aleutians were unknown, but their location was alarming. Just 2,000 miles from Seattle, a direct path to the North American coast. If Japan established airfields there, bombers could reach the continental United States. But when the first reconnaissance photos came in, no one could tell what they were seeing. The images were blurred by fog, grainy like ghosts. General Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. stared at the photographs and muttered, "Up there, you don't fight the enemy. You fight the weather." At that moment, the United States began preparing a counterattack, one it barely understood. To retake those 2 islands, the U.S. Army would have to learn how to fight in the coldest, most unforgiving corner of the world. No jungles, no palm trees. Only mountains, blizzards, and fog so thick it erased the horizon. For Japan, the Aleutian occupation was supposed to be a distraction, a lure to draw American attention away from Midway. But it worked too well. While Japan lost 4 carriers in the Central Pacific, its northern troops were stranded in isolation, cut off by weather and ice. By late 1942, their supplies were dwindling. Ships could not reach them. Planes disappeared into the mist and never returned. The garrisons on Attu and Kiska became prisons, surrounded not by enemies, but by storms. The same wind that Japan had called its ally now tore through their camps, freezing food, fuel, and flesh alike. Entire platoons vanished in avalanches. Officers froze in their tents. Radio operators sent frantic messages into static, pleading for evacuation that would never come. In the end, the Aleutians were not a fortress. They were a trap, built by arrogance, sealed by ice. As the snow closed over those lonely outposts, the Japanese command still believed they could hold. They had no idea that an American force was already assembling, determined to reclaim the only U.S. soil lost in the entire war. And when the counterattack finally came, the wind, their so-called ally, would kill more men than bullets ever could. May 11th, 1943. The fog was so thick it swallowed entire platoons. When the U.S. 7th Infantry Division landed on Attu, there was no roar of gunfire, no enemy waiting on the beach, only silence and the wind. The men expected machine guns, but met something worse. Nothing at all. They moved inland slowly, rifles raised, boots sinking into freezing mud. Their compasses spun uselessly. The radio crackled, then went dead. HQ, this is Able Company. Do you copy? Static. Captain Ralph Phillips glanced at his map. Blank white where the valleys should be. We could be walking in circles, he muttered. A private replied, Sir, I think we already are. The fog made sound deceptive. A single gunshot could echo from any direction. Soldiers flinched at their own echoes. By nightfall, they had advanced less than 500 yards. Temperatures dropped below 20 degrees. Canteens froze solid. Men huddled in foxholes filled with slush, trembling as wind howled through the mountains. They were hungry, soaked, and disoriented, fighting an enemy they could not see. Over the next days, patrols vanished into white nothingness. One squad disappeared while scouting a ridge. When search teams found them 2 days later, they were frozen where they stood, rifles still in hand. When the first real shots came, they came from the fog. Japanese snipers opened fire from hidden caves, unseen. The Americans fired back blindly, hitting nothing but snow and rock. An officer yelled, "Adjust fire!" But no one knew where the enemy was. The battle became chaos. Units firing in all directions, bullets snapping over helmets. In one tragic exchange, 2 U.S. platoons mistook each other for the enemy. By the time the shooting stopped, 10 Americans were dead, all killed by friendly fire. The enemy's greatest weapon was not their rifles, but the island itself. Every step was uphill, every inch a blizzard. Men slipped into ravines, their bodies vanishing into fog. Even the medics began to break. One wrote in his field diary, "We're not fighting men, we're fighting ghosts and weather." By May 25th, after nearly 2 weeks, the Americans had still not found the main Japanese position. The island seemed empty, and yet, every night, someone died. They finally reached Massacre Valley, a wide plain that stretched toward the mountains. It looked deserted, but the name should have warned them. At dawn, Japanese mortars opened fire. Shells rained down, explosions muffled by snow. The U.S. forces dug in, returning fire with M1 Garands and Browning machine guns. But the fog made aiming impossible. Even the artillery spotters were guessing. For nearly a week, the 2 armies fought like shadows, never seeing each other, only hearing. The ground itself was a graveyard of men lost between sound and silence. Then came May 29th, 1943. On the ridge called Engineer Hill, American troops thought the battle was almost over. Japanese resistance had weakened. Reports suggested the enemy was running out of food and ammunition. Some soldiers began cleaning their rifles, writing letters home. But just before dawn, out of the fog, came the sound. A low, rising scream. It grew into a roar. Thousands of Japanese soldiers, officers, engineers, even medics, charged downhill in one final, desperate attack. They had fixed bayonets, some carried swords, others only shovels. The largest banzai charge ever launched on American soil had begun. Machine gunners fired until their barrels overheated. Men screamed for ammo, then switched to pistols, knives, even fists. Grenades burst in the fog, illuminating faces for a heartbeat before darkness returned. The battle collapsed into chaos, hand-to-hand combat in near zero visibility. One American officer wrote later, "You couldn't tell who was who until it was too late." By sunrise, the ridge was covered with bodies. Americans and Japanese tangled together, the snow around them black with blood and mud. The banzai charge was over, but what it left behind was silence and shock. They thought the island was small, the enemy weak, the fight simple. May 29th, 1943. The men of the 7th Infantry Division thought it was almost over. The last Japanese attacks had grown weak. Scattered gunfire, the occasional mortar round that fell short. Rumors spread that the enemy had run out of ammunition. Some men dared to believe the island was theirs. On Engineer Hill, just south of Massacre Valley, American troops dug shallow trenches in the frozen soil. They cleaned their rifles, brewed coffee from melted snow, and spoke softly about going home. For the first time in weeks, the wind had calmed. Then, at dawn, a sound began to rise. Distant at first, like the roar of surf beneath the fog. It grew louder. Then came the screams. "Banzai! Banzai!" Out of the mist charged hundreds of Japanese soldiers. Officers, engineers, cooks, even medics. They were starving, wounded, but armed with bayonets, pistols, and swords. Some carried grenades clutched to their chests. They were not attacking to win. They were attacking to die. Machine gunners opened fire, belts of .30 caliber rounds tearing through the fog. Men screamed. Bodies tumbled forward, then disappeared into the mist. Still, the charge did not stop. Lieutenant Robert H. Jones shouted for more ammunition, his voice nearly drowned by the wind. When his gun jammed, he picked up a carbine and kept firing until the barrel smoked. Then they were among them, hand to hand, in fog so thick you could smell the breath of the man trying to kill you. Bayonets met bayonets. Knives flashed in the gray light. Grenades exploded at point-blank range. Men fell silently, their shapes swallowed by snow. A medic later wrote, "You could hear them before you saw them. And when you did, it was already too late." By sunrise, Engineer Hill was a nightmare. American soldiers fought in small knots, blind, deaf, bleeding. One group of engineers used shovels to fight back when their ammo ran out. When the fog lifted slightly, the full horror became visible. The slopes were littered with bodies, hundreds of Japanese, many still clutching their bayonets. Among them lay Americans, fallen beside the very trenches they had dug the night before. The Japanese commander, Colonel Yasuo Yamasaki, was found among his men. His pistol empty, his sword broken. He had led the charge himself, straight into the American lines. It was the largest banzai charge ever launched on U.S. soil, and it was over in less than 2 hours. But victory came with silence. The Americans stood in the snow, stunned by what they had seen. The fog settled again, muffling the world back into white stillness. For many of them, it no longer felt like a triumph. It felt like a nightmare, ending in exhaustion. Private Tom McCall later said, When the shooting stopped, I didn't cheer. I just sat down and listened to the wind. The battle for Attu was over. Of the 2,600 Japanese soldiers who had landed there a year before, only 29 were taken alive. The rest had chosen death. The Americans had reclaimed their own soil, but at a terrible cost. Nearly 4,000 casualties, many from frostbite, exposure, and FOM-friendly fire. The victory report would call it a complete success. But the men who fought there knew the truth. No one truly won in that place. As the bodies were buried under the snow, a soldier looked out toward the gray horizon and whispered, "We didn't conquer this island. It conquered us." They had believed the maps, believed the land was small, the fight simple. They had thought the enemy was just across the ridge. Now they knew better. They realized their maps and their assumptions were wrong. War in the Aleutians was not measured in miles or victories. It was measured in frostbite, exhaustion, and wrecked machinery. After the fighting on Attu, the U.S. military realized it had waged war in a place almost as deadly as the enemy itself. The code name was Operation Land Crab, but nothing about it was small. Nearly 94,000 soldiers, 300 ships, and more than 100,000 tons of supplies were committed to reclaiming 2 specks of land no bigger than New York City. The cost was staggering. Everything had to move by sea. Food, fuel, ammunition, tents, even the men themselves, across waters that could turn from calm to chaos in minutes. The North Pacific was a monster that devoured steel. Landing craft slammed into rocks, breaking apart in the surf. Crates of ammunition floated away before they could be unloaded. One naval officer wrote, "It wasn't a beach landing. It was a wrestling match with the ocean." Temperatures rarely rose above 20 degrees Fahrenheit. Winds howled at 100 miles per hour, strong enough to rip tents from the ground and hurl men into the sea. The Aleutians weren't just cold. They were alive, hostile, unpredictable. For the engineers and mechanics, the environment was a constant enemy. Permafrost seemed solid enough to build on, until engines started and heat seeped into the ground. Then the runways sank, swallowed by the earth itself. As one CB put it, "We built runways on ice and watched them sink." Planes that did take off often disappeared into fog thicker than smoke. Pilots spoke of flying blind through clouds so dense they lost sight of their own wings. When the wind shifted, it carried the smell of salt, oil, and frozen diesel, the scent of a war fought against nature. Even weapons betrayed their owners. M1 Garand rifles jammed with ice, bolts freezing shut after just a few shots. Machine guns had to be kept warm under blankets until the moment of battle. When soldiers pulled the triggers, many found only silence. Engines stalled. Fuel lines froze solid. Jeep tires cracked like glass under the cold. The island ate everything: metal, rubber, bone. In these conditions, every victory felt hollow. Even survival was a miracle. On Attu, 15,000 American soldiers faced roughly 2,600 Japanese defenders. By the end, the numbers blurred. Casualties on both sides, frostbitten, exhausted, starving. Of the American dead, nearly 70% weren't killed by enemy fire, but by the cold or by friendly bullets lost in fog. On the Japanese side, 90% died in combat or suicide, refusing surrender. It was not a battle of strategy. It was attrition against the elements. And for the men who endured it, even the simplest tasks became ordeals. To dig a trench was to fight a glacier. To build a fire was to gamble against the wind. To breathe was to inhale ice. The island punished every mistake. When soldiers tried to boil snow for drinking water, they found it laced with volcanic grit. When they slept, they woke half buried in frozen mud. And when they prayed, the wind carried their words away before heaven could hear. Back in the States, the newspapers printed maps with little arrows pointing north, calling it the Forgotten Front. But for the men who lived it, no one could forget. They fought not for glory, not even for land, but simply to hold ground against the world itself. And yet, somehow, through this cold, through this chaos, through this silence that swallowed every sound, the U.S. military managed to build airfields, supply chains, and a foothold that would one day link Alaska to the Pacific. It wasn't triumph through firepower. It was triumph through endurance. The men who survived Attu and Kiska didn't talk about tactics or medals. They talked about wind. They talked about frost. They talked about what it meant to fight in a place that didn't want them there and refused to let them leave. The Aleutians were not just a battlefield. They became an engineering experiment at the edge of the world. To fight there, America had to invent an entirely new way to wage war. From Dutch Harbor to Adak and onward to Attu, the U.S. Navy's construction battalions, the Seabees, worked in conditions no manual had ever prepared them for. They unloaded bulldozers that froze before they could start, poured concrete that cracked before it could dry, and fought a landscape that swallowed every foundation they laid. Each day began with wind. Snow drove sideways. Visibility dropped to nothing. And yet, under those skies, the Seabees built airstrips, fuel depots, radar stations, and docks. One shovel, one frozen hand at a time. The first landing strip on Attu was meant to be temporary. Packed gravel laid over permafrost. But permafrost is treacherous. It looks solid, but beneath the surface lies ice and mud. When engines of the P-38 Lightning fighters warmed up, the heat seeped downward. Within hours, the surface buckled and sank. A corporal wrote home, "We built runways on ice and watched them sink. The planes looked like they were landing on quicksand made of snow." The solution was brutal and clever. Layer after layer of steel matting. Thousands of sheets of perforated metal called Marston mats, shipped from Seattle and welded together by hand. Each section weighed 60 pounds, and men carried them through wind that could knock a man off his feet. By midsummer 1943, the U.S. had carved functioning airfields out of what was once wilderness. From those icy runways, B-24 Liberators and PBY Catalinas patrolled the northern Pacific, hunting Japanese submarines and scouting for enemy fleets. Radar outposts, crude but functional, dotted the ridgelines, giving early warnings of incoming aircraft. The Japanese had no such network. Their equipment, built for tropical climates, corroded in the salt wind. Radios froze. Batteries drained in minutes. Even their uniforms, cotton and wool, were useless against sleet and wind chill. A Japanese survivor later recalled, "We had guns and courage, but no protection from the sky. The island itself was our enemy." For the Americans, technology became the only advantage that mattered. They learned to turn logistics into a weapon. Cargo ships brought supplies in waves, ammunition, food, medicine, even prefabricated huts known as Quonset huts. Within weeks, barren tundra turned into a living base. Fuel lines snaked across the mud, linking storage tanks to generators. Pipelines carried gasoline to the airfields. Every crate was tagged, inventoried, logged. A triumph of organization amid chaos. And still, the weather fought back. On one night in October, a storm ripped through Adak. Winds reached 120 miles per hour. Entire warehouses blew into the sea. A destroyer broke its moorings and ran aground. In the morning, an engineer simply said, "We don't rebuild, we start over." The men worked with a kind of stubborn rhythm. Fix, lose, rebuild. The supply line from Seattle stretched more than 2,000 miles, threading through storms that could crush a ship like paper. Convoys sailed in silence, their decks sheathed in ice, their crews praying the fog would hide them from submarines. By the time Operation Cottage, the invasion of Kiska, began in August 1943, the Aleutian Campaign had become a logistical symphony. 94,000 troops, 300 ships and a mom on a mountain of supplies moved in coordination few wars had ever seen. It was America's industrial miracle, applied not to cities or factories, but to a frozen wasteland at the edge of the map. For every bullet fired on Attu, 1,000 gallons of fuel were burned to deliver it. For every soldier who stepped onto that island, 10 men worked behind him, loading, welding, repairing, and navigating an ocean of storms. It was not glamorous. There were no parades, no victory songs. But it was here, in the Aleutians, that the United States proved what it would soon demonstrate across the world. That logistics, not luck, wins wars. And though the cost was heavy, machines broken, men frostbitten, ships lost, the system held. Through sheer persistence, the Americans turned a battlefield of ice into a proving ground for modern war. By the end of 1943, the Aleutian front had turned from chaos into calculation, a cold, grinding machine of men and steel. Yet, beneath the discipline and data, it was still a war waged against the Earth itself. For every advance the Americans made, the island took something back. Engines froze, ships vanished in storms, men disappeared into crevasses and were never seen again. Nature collected its tax, in blood and iron alike. On Attu, 15,000 U.S. soldiers faced 2,600 Japanese defenders. By the time the island fell, nearly 3,800 Americans were dead or wounded. Across the field, 2,350 Japanese lay still, almost the entire garrison wiped out. The official reports broke the losses down to numbers, tidy on paper. Category United States Japan troops, 15,000, 2,600 casualties, 3,800, 2,350. Cause of death, 70% exposure and friendly fire, 90% combat and suicide. But numbers could not capture the smell of oil on frozen mud or the sight of a man's breath turning to ice as he spoke his last words. A sergeant who survived Attu later said, "You could tell when someone was dying. The frost on his face stopped melting. The wind did not care who wore which uniform. It cut through wool, leather, and skin all the same. Bullets could be dodged. The cold could not. When the U.S. Army's Signal Corps tried to establish radar stations across the chain, then they learned another lesson the hard way. The power generators worked until the exhaust froze solid. The radar dishes spun until the gears seized with ice. To keep them running, soldiers stood watch through the night, scraping frost with bayonets, their hands bleeding through gloves. One corporal wrote in his log, "The enemy's planes never showed up. The storm jammed our radar instead." The U.S. engineers began to adapt, wrapping machinery in tarps, burying cables under snow to keep them from snapping in the wind. They discovered that, in the Aleutians, technology had to behave like an animal, able to hide, hibernate, and survive. On Kiska, when the Americans landed during Operation Cottage, they found the enemy already gone, evacuated in silence weeks earlier. Still, 300 U.S. soldiers died there anyway, lost to friendly fire and accidents in fog so thick no one could see 10 feet ahead. The war had left them paranoid, exhausted, and surrounded by ghosts. One Marine radio operator wrote home, "We stormed an island that wasn't there." And yet, for all its waste and misery, the Aleutian campaign left behind more than graves. It left a blueprint. The lessons learned in Alaska would echo through every future war America fought. Engineers refined cold weather gear, parkas, insulated boots, moisture-proof ammunition. The Air Force perfected Arctic navigation and radar calibration, lessons that would later form the backbone of the North American Air Defense Command. Logisticians built standardized shipping and packaging systems, tested first on these frozen islands, later used to supply Normandy, Okinawa, and Korea. The Aleutians became a ghost classroom, brutal, silent, and unforgettable. In the debriefing report sent to Washington, one line stood out. It wasn't written by a general, but by a young lieutenant from the Corps of Engineers. His handwriting was barely legible, the ink smeared from rain. It read, "We built runways on ice and watched them sink. We built men the same way. The difference is, some of them didn't." That sentence was never published, but it was passed from officer to officer, a quiet warning from the edge of the world. Because the Aleutian campaign, more than any other, reminded the United States of a truth every soldier learns eventually. That nature, not the enemy, decides when a war is over, when the wind finally died, when the fog lifted from the graves on Attu and Kiska. All that remained was silence. A silence so deep you could almost hear the earth breathe. And if you ever stand there today, among the rusting wreckage and the lonely memorial crosses, you'll feel it too. The presence of a battle that no one saw, fought by men against a land that refused to yield. In war, courage wins battles. But in the Aleutians, endurance was the only victory. In war, nature is the fiercest enemy. When the last shots faded over Attu, the silence that followed didn't sound like victory. It sounded like loss. The American flag rose above the ridgeline on May 30th, 1943. Frost clung to the pole, and the wind tore at the fabric as if to remind the soldiers that the island belonged to no one. 15,000 men had landed on Attu. Barely half were still fit to stand. The rest lay frozen, bandaged, or buried beneath snow. In Washington, the headlines called it a triumph. Americans reclaim us soil. But the soldiers who were there knew better. They hadn't just fought the Japanese. They had fought the island, and the island had nearly won. For Japan, Attu was finished. Its garrison wiped out, its commander dead by his own hand. Only one outpost remained in the Aleutians, Kiska, 180 miles to the east. To the Americans, Kiska was the next step, the final stone in retaking the chain. But what they didn't know was that Kiska was already empty. In July 1943, under the cover of storms and fog, the Imperial Navy executed one of the most successful evacuations in the Pacific War. Using destroyers and submarines, they extracted more than 5,000 soldiers from Kiska without the Americans ever realizing. The fog that had once trapped them now became their escape. When U.S. intelligence intercepted the news, it was too late. But no one believed it. Commanders were convinced the Japanese still held the island. They prepared for an invasion, Operation Cottage, with 90,000 men and 300 ships. At dawn on August 15th, 1943, the assault began. Destroyers bombarded the shore. Battleships fired heavy shells into the mist. When landing craft hit the beach, soldiers charged forward with rifles raised and found nothing. No enemy, no gunfire, no resistance. Still, confusion reigned. Fog blanketed the island as it always had. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. Units lost contact, wandered off course, mistook each other for the enemy. Gunfire erupted. American against Canadian, unit against unit. In a few terrible hours, 313 men were dead or wounded, killed not by the Japanese, but by the fog and fear that haunted the Aleutians. One corporal wrote in his journal that night, "We fought ghosts in the fog." The entry was brief, scrawled in pencil, smudged by rain. It became the only record of a battle that had never truly happened. When the truth emerged, the Kiska had been deserted weeks before. Disbelief turned to embarrassment. Reporters in the States asked, how can an army lose men to an island with no enemy? The army buried the story. No medals, no fanfare, just silence. But for the men who'd been there, silence was the worst punishment. They had watched friends die in confusion, heard gunfire echo through fog so thick you couldn't tell which side you were on. And when it ended, there was nothing left to fight. Private William Jacobs of the 46th Engineers later said, "We came here to kill the enemy. Instead, we killed the air, the weather, and each other." The Aleutian campaign was technically a victory. 2 islands reclaimed, enemy expelled, American soil restored. But in the hearts of those who survived, it felt hollow. It was a victory without glory. The men left behind more than shell casings and wreckage. They left doubt. Doubt in strategy. Doubt in leadership. Doubt in the idea that war could ever be rational. As ships departed the Aleutians that autumn, one correspondent watching from the deck wrote, "We won the ground, but lost something else. Maybe our sense of purpose." That line never made it past the censors. But it captured what the Aleutians had become. A place where the line between victory and defeat was buried under snow. The soldiers who survived Kiska came home to silence. No parades, no medals. Their stories didn't fit the narrative of victory. Reporters wanted tales of heroism, of triumphs like Midway and Guadalcanal. But what could they print about men who fought ghosts and fog? What headline could make sense of soldiers dying on an island already empty? The truth was buried under bigger battles. By the end of 1943, the world's attention had shifted south, to Tarawa, to Italy, to the growing roar of war in Europe. The Aleutians vanished from the front page. The campaign that had claimed thousands of lives was reduced to a paragraph in military communiques. Even the soldiers' own families struggled to understand. Mothers received telegrams marked, "Killed in action, Aleutian Islands." They asked, "Where is that?" Some were told it was part of Alaska. Others were told not to worry. It wasn't real combat. But the men who'd fought there knew better. They'd seen comrades freeze to death within sight of campfires, seen friendly units annihilate each other in whiteout blizzards. They carried the memory of it long after the war ended. The sound of wind, the endless gray, and the guilt of surviving something so meaningless. Private First Class Jack Morrison, one of the last men evacuated from Adu, wrote in his diary, "We fought, we bled, we won, but no one seemed to care. Maybe that's what hell really is, a victory no one remembers." For the officers, the Aleutian campaign became a lesson in humility. It revealed the limits of maps, of planning, of human control. Generals who once spoke of precision landings now spoke of fog patterns and frost depth. A major in the Corps of Engineers said simply, "The island had the final say." Strategically, the U.S. victory in the Aleutians closed the northern gate of the Pacific. It denied Japan any chance of threatening the American mainland again. But tactically, it proved how fragile even modern armies were when stripped of warmth, light, and direction. Japan, too, paid a heavy psychological price. The evacuation of Kiska, though brilliant in execution, was a public humiliation. The Imperial High Command had spent months broadcasting the Aleutian conquest as a symbol of Japan's reach. Now, it was gone, erased, reclaimed by fog. In Tokyo, the news was quietly suppressed. Official communiques called it a strategic withdrawal. But in private, officers understood what it meant. The empire's northern edge had cracked. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already bleeding at Midway, was now frozen and buried beneath the Aleutian snow. In Washington, the campaign's lessons were quietly folded into doctrine. Reports filed by field commanders emphasized the need for cold weather gear, all-weather logistics, and improved navigation systems. The Army began training for Arctic warfare, something it had never considered before. In time, those lessons would save thousands of lives in future conflicts. But none of that mattered to the men who'd been there. When they spoke of the Aleutians, they didn't talk about strategy or logistics. They talked about what it did to them. They remembered the isolation, the silence that made you feel like the world had ended, the endless gray days when you couldn't tell the difference between dawn and dusk. A lieutenant remembered walking across the beach at Kiska after the fog lifted. He found the body of a soldier, American, frozen, rifle in hand, still staring into the mist. No one knew whose bullet had killed him. Maybe his own. Maybe a friend's. Maybe just fate. That image stayed with him. He later said, "That's what Aleut taught us. War isn't always about who wins. Sometimes it's just about who's left." The Aleutian campaign was officially declared a success. The islands were secure, the flag was raised, and the line of the Pacific defense was restored. But among the men who fought there, it became something else. A ghost story told in whispers, passed between veterans who rarely spoke of it. They called it the Forgotten War inside the Great War. And for decades after, even historians skipped the chapter entirely. There were no famous generals, no decisive victories, just fog, frost, and silence. Yet for those who were there, it was the most honest kind of war, one that stripped away all illusions of glory, leaving only endurance. When the war ended in 1945, most of the men who had fought in the Aleutians went home quietly. They didn't march in the VJ Day parades. They didn't tell stories at reunions. Many didn't speak about it at all. Because how do you explain a war no one saw? How do you describe fighting an enemy who was already gone? In veterans' hospitals, doctors noticed something unusual. The men from the Aleutians didn't talk about nightmares of combat. They talked about silence. They spoke of wind that never stopped, of fog that pressed on the lungs, of endless gray days that blurred together until time itself disappeared. Some couldn't sleep unless a fan was running, just to recreate the sound of the wind. A chaplain who had served on a dock wrote, "They weren't haunted by killing, they were haunted by emptiness." When the medals were handed out for campaigns across the Pacific, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima, the Aleutian ribbons looked almost out of place. Few even knew what they represented. A campaign fought in snow instead of sand. A victory that felt like surrender. For the Army, the official history moved on. Attu and Kiska were summarized in 2 paragraphs in a 500-page report. No presidential speeches, no war movies, no grand memorials. Only a few lonely crosses planted on the ridges above Massacre Valley, where the wind still blows the same way it did in '43. The world remembered the names Normandy, Midway, Bastogne. But Attu, Kiska, they faded like breath on glass. To most Americans, the Aleutian campaign became a footnote. The war at the top of the world, the battle everyone forgot. And maybe that was easier. Because remembering it meant confronting the truth that victory can be as cruel as defeat. One veteran, Sergeant Thomas Reeves, said it best at a reunion decades later. "We didn't fight for glory. We fought because someone had to stand there, where the map ran out." He paused, looked down at his hands, still trembling from the cold, even after all those years, and added quietly, "But when we came home, it felt like we'd never left that island. The fog followed us. That was the real cost of the Aleutians. Not the numbers or the strategy, but the doubt that crept in afterward. The sense that, even when you win, you can still lose something essential. Belief. Historians would later call it the Forgotten Front. But for the men who lived it, forgetting was impossible. They carried it in their bones, in the ache of frostbite that never healed, in the way they stared at the horizon whenever the weather turned gray. In letters, they rarely mentioned the enemy. Instead, they wrote about the silence, the loneliness, and the realization that the world didn't notice. A captain wrote to his wife in 1946, "Everyone thanks us for winning back Alaska, but no one asks what it took." Decades later, when memorials were finally built on Attu and Kiska, the plaques bore simple words: "For those who fought where no one was watching." Visitors today see the wreckage, twisted metal, broken helmets, rusting fuel drums, and assumed time erased it all. But the truth is, the fog never left. It's still there, crawling through the valleys, whispering through the grass, carrying the memories of men who were never celebrated. They called it a victory. But for those who were there, it was something else entirely. A reminder that war isn't just about courage or strategy, but about endurance, futility, and the thin line between purpose and madness. The Aleutian Islands campaign ended in triumph on paper. But in the hearts of those who survived, it ended in doubt. And so the wind keeps blowing across that frozen chain. Over the graves, over the wreckage, over the forgotten names. A ghostly reminder that sometimes, even when you win, you lose what makes winning matter. The Aleutian Islands. Cold, gray, forgotten. But their story didn't end in 1943. Long after the guns went silent, their lessons echoed through every decade that followed. For the United States, the campaign became more than a battle. It became a blueprint, carved in ice, written in frost, and sealed by the wind. In the aftermath, the Army and Navy studied every mistake, every breakdown, every life lost to the cold. They realized that the enemy had never truly been Japan. It had been nature itself. Engineers rewrote the manuals. They redesigned everything. Boots that didn't freeze, tents that didn't collapse in the wind, stoves that could burn at 20 degrees below zero. From those bitter experiments came the first generation of Arctic uniforms, insulated parkas, waterproof gloves, and double-soled boots. Gear that would later serve in Korea, Greenland, and beyond. The lesson stretched far past clothing. Logisticians turned the Aleutians into a case study on how to fight where there are no roads, no ports, no sunlight, and no forgiveness. They learned that supply lines were not just arteries of war. They were the heart itself. Lose them, and the body dies. Across the Pacific, new ideas began to take shape. What if, the strategists asked, another war came? One fought not in tropics or cities, but in the frozen north? The answer was born from the Aleutians. Within a decade, the first early warning radar chains were installed across Alaska and the Arctic Circle. A network designed to see beyond the fog, to catch what men could not. Those stations would later form the spine of the North American Aerospace Defense Command, NORAD, the invisible shield of the Cold War. The men who once froze on Attu could not have imagined that their suffering would lay the foundation for a new kind of defense. One built not on courage, but on anticipation. Even the Air Force traced its roots to lessons learned here. In the Aleutians, pilots had faced weather worse than enemy fighters. They had learned to navigate by instinct, by cloud breaks, and intuition when compasses failed. From that came new instruments, better flight suits, and the birth of modern Arctic aviation. In an ironic way, the most desolate battlefield of the Pacific became one of the most valuable classrooms in military history. Strategically, the Aleutians taught America something else, something larger. That the North Pacific, once dismissed as empty ocean, was in fact the front porch of the homeland. Whoever controlled that expanse of water, those islands, those skies, held the keys to continental security. During the Cold War, radar domes replaced bunkers, and long-range bombers traced flight paths that mirrored the same routes once used by Japanese reconnaissance. The Aleutians became the silent sentinels of a new era. Still isolated, still frozen, but never forgotten by those who understood their importance. And yet, beyond the military blueprints and cold statistics, the human lesson endured. War had met its match, not in weapons, but in weather. Technology bent to the will of nature, and men were reminded that no invention could ever outsmart the earth itself. Decades later, historians revisiting the campaign described it not as a failure or a triumph, but as a mirror. It reflected the limits of human control, a reminder that war is never truly ours to command. If you walk those islands today, the evidence remains. Airstrip ruins half swallowed by tundra. Radar towers rusting into the sea. Metal bones of aircraft buried under moss and snow. And yet, beneath that decay lies the quiet legacy of adaptation, of learning to survive where survival itself seemed impossible. For the veterans, that was the only meaning worth keeping. They didn't fight for headlines or history books. They fought to prove that even in the harshest corner of the planet, humanity could endure, not conquer, but endure. A general once said of the Aleut campaign, "We went there to win a war. What we found was a truth." He paused, looking out over the frozen horizon. In war, nature is the fiercest enemy. They were soldiers who battled fog instead of fame, frost instead of fire. Their footprints vanished within hours, erased by the same snow that covered their fallen. No flags waved, no cameras rolled, but their courage held the line where the world forgot to look. The Aleutian Islands campaign, the war America forgot, fought on its own land. Because history is not only made on beaches and in cities. Sometimes it's written in the wind, on islands of ice, where men fought simply to be remembered, subscribe to battle records, and rediscover the forgotten fronts of World War II.